monetization through hate clicks. People, enragement is engagement, especially through social media. So people are more likely to share something that makes them angry.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'm probably guilty of this too. Well, I know I'm guilty of this. So.
I try not to read this stuff. I will skim it. And that sort of has brought a particular frustration of mine, which is why I tend to ravenously devour papers, which are few and far between we get access to, because a lot of them are paywalled, right? Mm-hmm. A problem I have seen is a serious methodology problem when it comes to this sorts of research. You said they go in biased, mm-hmm. but I sort of hit a point in a lot of studies where, well, this research is now useless. This tells me nothing because of a critical flaw, like that paper out of Italy that took, people played Grand Theft Auto and then they were more racist and sexist and all that stuff. But I looked at the age range in that paper. Yeah. Developmentally, a 15-year-old male and a 23-year-old male have nothing in common. They're going to respond to things significantly differently.
Yeah.
That 15 to 18-year-old cohort could have skewed the responses for the entire group, because they're so, they're still developing humans, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you about your methodology. You tried really hard as best you could. And I know Brad worked really hard on this to control for this kind of stuff. But the best control you could get was Pew Research. And mm-hmm. even the Pew Research political typology quiz is a little bizarre to me. Like, it's a series. There were 3 or 4 questions when I took it. I came out as, solidly liberal? What did it call me? Solid liberals. Yes, I am 16% of the population that is solidly liberal.
Yeah.
Nobody in games journalism will believe that. They think I'm some kind of, randy and crazy person.
Yeah.
It was a series of false binaries. It's the best you have. Mm-hmm. How do you handle knowing, okay, we got to do the best we have. We have to get the best data. It's impossible to get perfect, pristine conditions. But at what point do you determine that it's good enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably, the scientific, from the view as a scientist, we would always say nothing's really ever good enough, in the sense of, that's why I keep saying, like, part of our hope, certainly part of my hope is that this will encourage other scholars to perfect what we did. I think Brad and I would both say, like, this is by no means a perfect study. It's the first piece of data that has been published, which is weird. It's been 6 years, since Gamergate. Yeah. Nobody's ever bothered to do a survey or anything or study. So it's the first piece of evidence. But if people don't disbelieve us, and do a better study, and even if they find out different results, that's great.
Okay.
Because we just need some better data. I mean, this one I thought was cool because it was a chance to kind of compare gamer responses on, a certain set of questions that, basically, yeah, you're right. It was, a limited set of questions. Actually, it was Pew that basically picked the questions because
mm-hmm.
original survey, but it gave us a chance to sort of compare gamers, or at least the Gamergate supporters that responded to the survey, to sort of like the nationally representative sample of individuals, and get a sense, at least generally, whether there was a sense of, Gamergate supporters really sort of leaning towards alt-right. And it really seemed like it was the opposite, if anything, that Gamergate supporters tended to be more liberal on average compared to the general. That doesn't mean that there aren't, other, a variation within them. But you're right. It's a binary too. It's like basically how liberal versus conservative are you? And another scholar, just in personal communication, even said, well, what about like libertarianism? Like, is this really sort of like, because you can get these like liberal libertarians. I think that's kind of how I describe myself, actually.
That's how I describe myself too. Yeah. So I mean, some of the questions on the Pew thing, I'm like, this is a false choice. Like one question is, government has a role to play in regulating business versus government is terrible at regulating business. And I'm like, well, both can be true. Just because you have a role doesn't mean you're good at it. And I'm like, I don't know what to pick. Yes, like both. And so I sort of went, click, right? Yeah. And like, this is the issue, is I get why you felt the need for a control. I thought that was very, very important. The control had some issues with it. And now that doesn't mean I think that it's not still useful, because it wasn't like, well, here's a number. You were comparing it to the general population.
Right.
And that's what I thought was interesting. And on that point, and you touched on this in your paper, how do you separate, or is it possible to separate gaming culture behaviors or cultural points from online culture or online discourse? Is it possible to separate that? I don't know. You tell me.
No, that's a fantastic question, and yeah, that would be, I think, kind of difficult to some extent. And of course, that's one of the things. It's like there's a sense of like broadly online culture, whether you're talking about gaming or knitting. I mean, I'm not even picking that example randomly. Like I remember reading an article about like the toxicity of online knitting communities.
Mommy blogs.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Horribly toxic community. Like,
like why are people that upset about knitting? I don't know, but there just seems to be something about going online, and you could even see it in the debate about Gamergate, that people are complaining about Gamergate supporters being toxic, but they're complaining about that in the most toxic possible way. So it just kind of like goes around, and I don't know. I mean, so there was another. I don't know why I'm picking on Pew today. So there was another Pew study, and I'm sure it was also imperfect, but it looked at like online harassment and such, and it was sort of interesting because they basically find that online harassment is common.
Yes.
It's common both in men and women, although women face more sexual harassment, which is probably not a stunner.
But men are more likely to get openly violent threats.
Right.
Online. It's the same study that we're referring to. Okay.
Yeah. And they kind of looked like, where do you get harassed? And and of course some people do say they get harassed in online gaming, but like the big sites actually were social media, which is probably not surprising, and also like when articles have comment sections. So in comment sections, people reported getting harassed a lot. So there was more problems, which again, it probably isn't going to surprise anybody. So basically kind of said like Twitter is worse than gaming, when it comes to harassment, which probably isn't going to, again, shock a lot of people. And like comment sections also tend to be pretty terrible, which again, probably isn't going to stun anybody. So
Reddit is also a major shaper of this whole thing, because the anti-Gamergate subreddit and the pro-Gamergate subreddit, you guys got your people through Kotaku in Action, who have a very like-hate relationship with me. Some people think I'm okay. Then there are people who just utterly cannot stand me. And, some people would consider some of the things people say about me on Reddit harassment, but they're not saying it to me, they're saying it about me, and that's their right. So unless they're trying to whip people up and get people to actively come after me, I don't have to go there. I don't have to see it. I don't have to look. I really don't care. Opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one, right? Some people have two, and they're fun at parties. But defining harassment, I think that the Pew study there was good because they defined different types and sort of rank them in severity.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've just been doing this too long. I came from music programming before I moved to games, and 14-year-old girls were just as nasty when you said something about their favorite boy band that they didn't like. It really, the similarity to me, and then there's that, because that's an identity thing, right? That sort of libidinous connection that 14-year-old girls have with whatever, One Direction, or the sort of practice relationship waifu thing that gamers have with anime style characters. There's that plank. But then there's the marginalized community element, and I see a lot of similarities with the hostility in lower socioeconomic communities and people coming in and, hey, let's do trust falls and hug exercises. And they're like, get away from me. And,
Mm-hmm.
and it does seem very hostile, but that's a trauma response.
Mm.
And it's, how I know Brad spent a lot of time sort of cultivating relationships. How do you keep that required academic distance to make sure you're not biasing your survey or polluting your results, but
Mm-hmm.
then get a group like this to trust you? Because I know you've done juvenile justice
Mm-hmm.
stuff too. Same problems there, right? How do you get people to trust you enough to participate in your survey in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think a lot of it, like you said, does come down to doing what you can to try to communicate that you're as neutral as possible. I mean,
Okay.
nobody's entirely neutral, right? So, um, and I think, Brad had done a lot of the groundwork. He did all the groundwork with the survey, to be honest. So he was, I think, like you said, he had cultivated some trust in some of those communities, so they knew that he wasn't going to make them look as bad as possible,
Yeah.
necessarily. And you see this still with the video game industry, right? Video game industry is suspicious of social psychologists or social scientists for exactly the same reason, that there's been this history of social psychologists smearing the video game industry as negatively as possible. And that really hurts trust, right? So now tech companies have, mounds of data they could share, but they don't want to because they're used to being bashed, sometimes perhaps fairly, but oftentimes unfairly, by social scientists. So why would they want to help? If they're gonna get bashed anyway.
Well, and their own enthusiast press. I mean, I've watched the access just decline over the years. It's impossible, unless you're a guy like Jason Schreier, who has a ton of sources and has the ability to just, people send him tips because it's him. It's impossible. It's impossible to get meaningful access now. Everything is so closed up, and it's a shame. It's not helping gamers. It's not helping people try to decide which games to buy. It's not helping gaming as a whole, and it's not helping the companies. Like,
Right.
it's really frustrating, which is why I'm asking. So you're saying neutrality is the best way to go at it.
The most that you can convincingly argue, and by convincingly, I mean to sincerely mean it,
Right.
that you say, I would like to do a study on this. I actually do not give a crap how it turns out. I would like to just publish it, whatever the data says.
Okay.
Because on the other hand, you don't want to say, hey, take this and don't worry about it. It's going to look good for you, because that's also biased, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think as long as you say, like, look, we're just trying to collect some data. I have no real, literally, if it comes out one way, I think it's fascinating. If it comes out another way, I still think it's fascinating. And so I don't have a huge axe to grind, on this particular issue. Like with prisoners, I actually, in my early years, going way back to graduate school, I did a lot of research with prisoners. And a lot of it is, because they're obviously a suspicious population. There's a lot of opportunity for coercion there. So you have to be very careful working with that group.
Also, a lot of telling you what they think you want to hear.
There can be some of that, because they're afraid that you're going to go back to the COs and
that's right.
So what you usually end up with is and I work with both men and women, but you usually have one person who's like the extrovert and brave one who will come and take your survey. It was survey stuff that I was doing with them. And then nothing bad happens to them. They don't get referred to solitary. They don't get any kind of punishment for saying stuff that's truthful or embarrassing. They don't get a new charge. Or something of that sort. And then usually that person will then say hey, this guy's coming around. In my case, I was still a student, so that I think worked in my favor as well. I always treated them with respect. So which is something they don't always experience. And so I got credibility, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so then I got lots of people that were sort of open to it. I think in that case it was establishing that sense of I'm open to the idea of publishing stuff that might challenge my own view of the world. If I can show that this has happened, and for me that has happened. And I can point to examples where I thought this would be so cool because I thought it would come out this way, and it didn't. It came out this way instead, and I still think it's cool. And if you can do that, I think that will reassure people. And again, if you can kind of point to like, look, here's some examples of stuff I've done in the past. You know, I don't think I have the tendency to be a moral grandstander necessarily. You know, I don't know. At least I like to think. Maybe people disagree, but then I think all that stuff kind of helps. You know, so because there is that sort of like community defensiveness that can be, you know, something of a problem, you know, for some of this stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, but you came into this whole Gamergate situation basically slightly or moderately on the Gamergate is bad opinion. I mean, I did too when I first started looking into it.
Yeah.
What changed your mind? Because I know what my answer is. I think your answer is going to be completely different.
Yeah, so I think the analogy to actually, and you know, maybe it's unfair to personalize it at all. It's kind of like my views of Anita Sarkeesian have changed, you know, over the last, what would it be, 6 years or so.
Interesting.
And I don't have a negative view of her, but I have a less positive view, I guess you might say, over time. In the sense of like when she first released the Tropes versus Women series, I thought and still do think that her first episode was fantastic. And I really, really liked that first episode. And I thought she had a lot of really fair points. And I was very sympathetic to her because she put together something I thought was pretty good quality, that made a lot of fair points, that was reasonable, and then got like harassed to shit over it. You know.
Well, in fairness, the harassment started before the first episode even came out.
True.
The Kickstarter got attacked. Yeah. Oh.
You know, so I think that, again, 2014, I thought I was really pretty clearly on the Anita Sarkeesian side. And again, it's not like now I'm like on an anti-Anita Sarkeesian side, but what happened, I think, is so she did the first episode, then she did a second episode, and the third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh. I don't know how.
Quality kind of.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the level of reasonableness changed. So she went from saying like, hey, look, games are great. You know, I'm not saying games cause problems or violence or anything like that. It would be nice if it wasn't the same kind of sexist trope. Well, I agreed with that. That made a lot of sense. You know, and then she kind of started veering more often into the like, this is bad. You know, this is going to affect people's opinions. This is going to affect people's behavior. Like, the data don't really say that. And the more she kind of went into places where I like, that's not what the science says. That's not what the science says. Then I started to get like a little bit more worried. And again, it's not a bad, I mean, I wish her well. I mean, you know, I think she still has some good points, you know, that she made. So, but I think it's kind of a similar thing, that the harder the views on the other side got, the more I started to question them. And I think that's a common problem for a lot of like advocacy in general, is that advocates for any cause have difficulty admitting when they've been successful, you know, so they just keep moving goalposts and get more and more ideological and more rigid over time, even if the original cause is a good one, you know. And I think that, you know, where, you know, and I'm not trying to pick on her specifically. It's just that she's an easy one for me to remember.
And unfortunately, because gaming has not diversified its female opinion voices, there's very few people with even remotely that level of recognition. I feel bad for her the same way, because even though I profoundly disagree with her on a lot of points, I think she takes a lot of unnecessary crap. She dishes out a lot of unnecessary crap as well. But it is a problem that there's one person.
Yeah.
And so everything gets focused on her. And that's not her failing. That's an industry failing. That's an enthusiast media failing. It's not fair to put that much on a single person.
Right.
So yeah. So
I'm sure to some extent her, you know, I mean, I'm reading psychology into her, which is not fair. I've never met her, you know, so, but I can imagine the possibility that, you know, as she became subject to all this harsh harassment and stuff, that may have further hardened her view. Yeah. So it could be something of a feedback loop as well. But, you know, I sort of think like it's a shame in some respects that she did stop at maybe like 3 episodes. You know, because I think, you know,
or stuck to established archetypes, right? Stuck to established tropes. When you make up a trope to poke at it, it's what everybody knows, the damsel in distress, right? Women as background decoration, like that's not, you know, you're talking about non-playable characters, you're talking about environmental population. That is not an established thing. Right. And that, I think, goes into that thing of what you said earlier, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, that people go in sort of, you set a paradigm that you can argue. that's not useful if it's not actually a legitimate paradigm that people can replicate.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of those later tropes versus women videos where I'm going to set this arbitrary boundary on something and show you how bad it is.
Right.
Yeah. Now that brings me into another sort of thing that I want to sort of land on, broaden the scope, because gaming took a real hit when this sort of problem gaming addiction thing came in, and it's tough. It's tough for the industry to sort of fight off ongoing accusations of violence, ongoing accusations of sexism, and now this gaming addiction thing, or problem gaming, as the World Health Organization says. And I was really, I full disclosure, guys, I consulted Professor Ferguson for Boss Fight, because I was like, there's giant gaping holes in the data. And when I went and I looked at it, there's a lot on violence in gaming. We can be reasonably certain there is no link there. There's been 10 years, and I'm being conservative, more like 20, of research on that. But gender in games, gender in media in general, the consensus is changing rapidly. I've noticed within the last 3-4 years. But then this idea of gaming being addictive. Let me see if I get this right. There is very little evidence, like scientific, published, peer-reviewed evidence, that shows an isolated, determined, addictive quality in video games the way we see in gambling, right? The idea of problem gaming is sort of, there are countries around the world that treat people for this particular behavior. Therefore, we're going to call it a thing to acknowledge sort of pockets of global opinion. That seems to be where that World Health Organization designation came from. The fact that there are clinics in places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. I don't know if China's on that list. I know that they are on that list. What are the
top?
Yeah. And then very, very expensive inpatient clinics in the US that look sketchy based on what I looked at. Now I get going, yes, okay, parents, your son's a gaming addict. Let us treat him as an endpoint, right? But you have this conflict between what the World Health Organization is saying to great fanfare, and then what the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual version 5 is not saying. So you've got the gold standard of psychiatric definitions for most of the world, except China, saying we cannot determine at this time that this is an independent thing. But then you've got the World Health Organization that has come under fire politically lately going, it's kind of a thing. We're going to say it's a thing. That pronouncement was badly misreported, but they do have stuff on there. And the language is very, very wishy-washy.
It is, yeah.
So what's going on here?
Yeah. That's a great, So I think the video game industry has successfully fought off the violence in video game thing. So I think that, they got the Supreme Court in the U.S. They have the Supreme Court decision behind them at this point. And like you said, the research is really turned against the idea that games contribute to anything we care about. And even if we look at like mild aggression, I think the evidence is really turned against even the idea that mild aggression is influenced by games. But so that's been fought off. I don't think that, in terms of like empirical evidence, I don't think there's much to suggest that sexism, sexualized content in games produces anything either. So I think
it's impossible to separate from general media, right? You can't isolate one thing. Cultivation theory has never worked that way. This program made you a sexist. Right. That's not how it works, right?
Yeah, but you can do like experiments and see how they, and see if that changes people's, attitudes towards women, or again, usually mild aggression towards women or things like that. And I don't think we're seeing. Yeah, at least there's not nearly as many studies in that realm as there are with the violence in video games area, but it's following the same pattern. There's just not this, and that's again where I've sometimes have, been a little bit like, I've started to blanch when I heard like people talk about sexualization in games. It's a reasonable issue,
Right.
but when people started making sciencey claims about it, then I get a little bit worried. Because the science really isn't supporting in a cultivation model. It's not supporting the cultivation.
No, yeah, it's not certainly no first order effects. So they bump to second order effects, and now we're not finding second order effects either.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I guess sometimes the goalposts keep moving, which is that old, like, games won't make you do X, but they might change our societal attitudes towards whatever that's.
This is also a field where the goalposts move, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong. Define sexy, define sexualized, define hypersexualized, right? If a woman happens to be well endowed but not showing very much, is that sexualized? A lot of people would say yes. League of Legends characters came under attack recently because of body proportions. Well, body proportions don't change if a woman is depicted in a non-sexualized pose or a sexualized pose. Then you get into manners of dress. Then you get into actual depiction of sex acts. All those things are thrown into the same pot and not examined with any nuance. Like, I haven't seen anything that sort of controls for those various issues, right? I mean, you've done stuff on thin ideals, right? That's one bucket. But, if they show, say, an Overwatch character who's a bigger girl in a sexy role, isn't that positive? But it's still sexualized,
right? Yeah.
So, like, there's been a lot of flattening of a very nuanced issue.
Yeah.
Now, is that academically wrong, or does this happen with everything and I'm just reading too much into it?
Both. I mean, it happens with everything, and it's wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right to be critical of it. Yeah. So it's the same thing that happened with violence. And what is a violent video game? We have no idea.
Is Mario jumping on a Koopa violent? Is he squashing a Koopa? Is that violent?
A lot of stuff gets lumped together. So same thing. What is a sexualized video game? So the go-to game is Grand Theft Auto. Like, if anybody's going to study it, they're going to study Grand Theft Auto. But if you look at like Grand Theft Auto, right, it's a sexualized game, but it's not a sexy game. You know what I mean?
Not at all. It's the opposite.
It's like
grotesque.
Really. Yeah. Just, nobody goes there to be aroused, by anything, or hopefully most people don't.
The sex with prostitutes, and especially Grand Theft Auto 4, I got depressed.
Yeah,
I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I can't handle this dude's self-loathing.
Right, it is really sad. Like, the whole thing is just really sad. It would make you feel sad about sex, So,
as opposed to a game like, as opposed to a game like Saints Row, where you run around with a giant purple dildo bat. Like, these things are not created equal, right?
But so it's definitely lazy science, but it's also so it's common, yes, but it's also bad, But in terms of like the gaming disorder thing, I think
getting back to that,
the real big challenge for the industry at this point, and really their Achilles heel has been the loot box issue or the loot crates,
yes. But is that games are addictive, or gambling mechanics put into games are addictive?
Correct. And that's what we don't know. And so we don't have any evidence at this point that loot boxes are addictive in any way through either mechanism. What we do know is that people who are already problem gamblers, tend to spend more on loot boxes than people who are not problem gamblers, to the tune of on average about $50, American $50.
Oh, wow, that's all.
Yeah. So it's not a huge difference. Now there might be some outliers who spend more, but in terms of the mean difference is about
interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So there is an effect. It's a small effect for the most part.
Now, is that monthly or across their? Okay, monthly. Well, that can add up. That's that's $600 a year. That's
depends on your income, obviously. So whether that's gonna sting or not, if you're Bill Gates, you never notice it. If you're a struggling student, it's gonna sting.
Yeah.
So it's there, but it's important to put that into perspective. That people sometimes think, well, it's thousands of dollars a month. It's not. It's 50. Whether that's important or not is a subjective position, But I think the mistake that the industry made is obviously the loot crates are lucrative. They're a revenue stream, and they got defensive about it. So they didn't want, at least it's my understanding, is that they didn't want to put any kind of like content labels. I think they've now changed. So I know I've seen some reports that in the US and Europe, they're going to start putting the content labels on there. So, but for a while there, they kind of like dug their heels in and said, nah, this is no big deal. Everybody loves loot crates and we'll just carry on, you know,
Right.
and that opened up a big target, you know, so I think they're wise to now go ahead and put the, you know, now they can say, look, we're doing something, we're being proactive. So
But
I
these are all
think
business concerns. This isn't scientific consensus.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Say that again.
These are all business concerns. This is marketing. This is not a scientific consensus that gambling mechanics in games make games more addictive or games are inherently addictive.
There definitely is no consensus that games are, you know, I think probably most people don't like loot boxes, but
I can't stand them. I just want to be able to buy the item I want. I miss those days, right? Or heaven forbid, I want to be able to unlock those characters. That'd be great. I miss those days, you know?
Yeah. So I don't think you'll find scholars that are like, I love loot boxes and I think we should have more of them. You know, in the same way that I think some scholars were like, you know, Grand Theft Auto is fine. And, you know, people should be able to play, you know. So I think probably most scholars would say like, we'd rather there weren't loot boxes, but in terms of like how much of an impact they really have, I think there's still some debate about that.
That's very interesting. Now, I mean, there are games do use psychology to induce certain behaviors, right? That those are established psychological principles that, you know, carrot and stick sort of positive motivation, negative motivation sort of thing. Do you think there is grounds for taking the addiction element off the table? We may go back to it, but for now, this practice that, you know, artificially encourages people to play for significantly longer than they otherwise would. Is that an industry practice that we should be scrutinizing?
I mean, it's worth looking at. I think that there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to assume that it's bad and that we should look at it because it's bad.
Okay.
Stop it. And I don't think that's the right approach necessarily. In that, you know, when people design stuff they want other people to buy, this is what they do, is they try to get those people to engage with that stuff more. It's not like a thing that games only do. I mean, like books do this, you know, so if you read a lot of novels, you may notice that the novels tend to end their chapters in the middle of a scene.
Yes. And then I can't stop reading and I'm up till 4 a.m. Yeah.
Read a novel fast and you have to buy another one.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I mean, this is, you know, a thing that lots of people do, you know, lots of industries do some variant of this. So the question becomes, is there this sort of like insidious, and where do we draw the line between trying to engage people so they're having fun more,
right,
a bad thing, as opposed to let's sucker every dollar out of these people in a way that's unhealthy for them, you know?
I think that's the concern a lot of gamers have, is I'm not having fun, I'm grinding.
Right, yeah. But there's one game, and you have to forgive me, I'm not always, like, I can't always remember every game name, but I know there was one game that was known for being a grinding game. And then in like the second version, they tried to take the grinding out, and a lot of players complained because they wanted to go back to grinding. So you end up with this, I don't know if you off the top of your head know what game I'm thinking of, if that sounds familiar or not.
Well, I know a few more obscure kind of South Korean games that they're grindy. They're Korean level grinders. People who like those games, they like the grind. You know, I know there was a time where they were trying to, like with Oblivion and in the Elder Scrolls line, they were trying to make it a more contained experience because people didn't want to dump 80 hours in. And general consensus, I disagree, but that Oblivion was the weakest of the Elder Scrolls games. So that there's an example right there of but I mean, that's changing a core mechanic and alienating your base, right? Like again, we're talking about marketing. I'm talking about those things of, oh, you have to grind these ridiculous, monotonous, mundane challenges to get the platinum trophy. And a small percentage of people absolutely love doing that. Most people, I know I've been like, this is so boring, but I want that little bloop. I want that little reward that pops up and it's like achievement unlocked sort of thing. And I know I'm being stupid. This doesn't get me anything in my life. And yet it's giving that reward center in my brain a boost. And that's where people claim games are addictive, that there is this reward center in your brain that is being bombarded with dopamine or adrenaline, whatever chemical people want to claim.
Dopamine, yeah.
Real life can never give you the same dopamine surge that a game will. Therefore, you're going to get dependent on that surge over time.
Right. Yeah, that's the narrative.
Right. Okay, you call it a narrative, though.
It's a narrative, yeah.
Because the other side of this is that you're getting the dopamine surge because it's an achievement. If you went out and played sports or got a promotion at work or something like that, you would get the exact same surge. This is how dopamine is supposed to work.
Right. Yeah, and that's the two sides of it. And there really are two issues. There's like the dopamine reward issue, and then there's also like the reinforcement schedule issue. So the two things kind of play some role with each other. So the argument is, again, like you said, there's a sort of dopamine reward system, and then you get these hits of dopamine, and they make it sound like it's cocaine, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, the spike in games is here, whereas heroin and cocaine are like, there's no comparison.
There's no comparison. There's no comparison between the two. But there's also this kind of like, what is it? Intermittent reinforcement schedule kind of an issue thing. Like if you get, that's where the gambling comparison is sometimes made. Like
because it's designed to give you little boosts,
and you don't know when they're coming. So you keep doing the behavior because you don't know when they're going to come.
That's the loot box design,
that's the loot box
right there.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
Yeah. So the whole like dopamine reward system is it's normal. This is a natural, normal system. Yeah. So dopamine isn't released when you play the game. Dopamine is released when you're anticipating playing the game. So when you're looking forward to doing something fun is when you get the dopamine. So you might notice this if you think of like whatever your funnest thing you don't always get to do is, like it's not very routine. Like if you like going to Disney World and you live in Canada, unlike Orlando, and you don't get to go all the time, rubbing that in a little bit. But when you go on your Orlando vacation, when you're going to the airport, you're like, oh my God, I'm getting on the plane. That's that dopamine hitting you. It's like the anticipatory excitement that comes from.
So it's adrenaline when you're actually playing?
Adrenaline just means that your sympathetic nervous system has been activated.
Okay.
So that just makes you, adrenaline makes you feel more wired, I guess, in a way. And it's really designed to sort of help you in situations where you need physical exertion, but of course it can be released whenever you feel stressed.
When I finish 2 or 3 hours of Doom Eternal on Twitch, I am sweating. I am tired. There is a crash after that because that game is so fast, but I'm like, I feel alive. And I think it's good, but obviously you can't do it for longer than that. Even 3 hours is pushing it for me. But these are natural. This would be the same rush you'd get if you really loved your job or you really loved your spouse or in my case, your cat. These are not, it's not the same as taking a drug and rewiring your system to an unnatural peak.
Correct.
Okay, these are in the realms of normal.
Response. Yeah.
Why do you think games are bad as opposed to the working world and the educational world sucks right now and needs to provide similar structures to what video games do successfully?
Yeah. Well, games are bad because old people don't like games.
That's it.
Yeah, that's really the main driver of this.